Hello, you're watching Context. I'm Orkan Amashov here to ask relevant questions in pursuit of illuminating answers. No discernible decrease has been observed in the volume or gravity of the inquiries concerning the wider Middle East over the past few weeks. What one might call inquisitive homeostasis, that delicate balance between the number of legitimate questions about Iran's nuclear aspirations or capabilities and Israel's perception of their scope and potential, and the relative certainty of answers provided in response to them, seems at last to have been restored. That balance was conspicuously absent on the 22nd of June when President Donald Trump declared the complete obliteration of Fordow and, by extension, a fundamental dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. Ambiguity, however, has returned, albeit not to the full extent. Indeed, Israel's initial strikes on the 13th of June, reciprocated by Iranian retaliation of somewhat lesser destructiveness, followed by a 10-day missile exchange and culminating in the United States' direct intervention through devastating bunker-buster attacks on Iran's principal nuclear sites, may have resolved certain questions, only to give rise to others. These questions are not merely confined to the US-Iran or Israel-Iran theater alone. They extend to the South Caucasus as well, where Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia have pursued a position of deliberate neutrality, with the possible exception of Yerevan, which has publicly supported its ally Iran. Azerbaijan, for its part, closed its airspace during the height of the conflict, reiterating unequivocally that its territory would not be used directly or indirectly against any third state, including Iran. Nevertheless, an interesting point has arisen very recently. According to the Iranian readout of the most recent phone conversation between President Ilham Aliyev and President Masoud Pezeshkian, held after the ceasefire, Iran's leader called for an investigation into unconfirmed reports that Israel's drones and micro-aerial vehicles might have been utilized Azerbaijani airspace to conduct strikes against Iran. The Azerbaijani account of the same telephone conversation between the two leaders makes no mention of this particular point. In that sense, many of the questions pertaining to Iran's engagement with the South Caucasus, questions that were valid before this latest episode, remain just as pertinent today. Joining me now in the studio is our very own Ubay Shapanda, A News Washington correspondent, who remains in Baku owing to the ongoing disruptions to international air traffic. Ubay, great to see you back in the studio. So you've been here for a couple of days, and our last conversation took place on the 22nd of June, I believe.
Yeah.
So now today, on the 23rd of June, what is your evaluation? There have been two points of view. One is about complete obliteration, one is more reserved. What is your feeling now about all of the accounts that we have heard so far?
Enormous damage. That is how the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency described the aftermath of what remains of Iran's underground nuclear program. And I think that's very significant to hear Rafael Grossi, the head of this International Atomic Oversight Agency, describing the impact that the American airstrikes, which included well over a dozen 14,000 kilogram bombs penetrating deep underneath the Iranian mountains, where Iran's main nuclear enrichment sites of Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan were located. We're also, of course, we heard from the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense, who gave a remarkable press briefing with significant amount of detail of the American B-2 strikes on Fordow. Of the hundreds of Pentagon briefings that I've viewed over the years, this is perhaps one of the most detailed ones that we've had to date. And what the military described is how those massive ordnance penetrators were used to cause significant structural damage to Fordow. American intelligence believes that much of the remaining highly enriched uranium, up to 60%, has been buried underground, including those really advanced and sensitive centrifuges. Remember, you need very technically advanced centrifuges that constantly spin around to enrich that uranium, and it's very easy to damage them because they are just so sensitive. So even if those centrifuges below ground, hundreds of meters in Fordow, were not totally destroyed by the explosion, the preceding shock waves would have likely knocked them offline and significantly damaged them, if not rendered them irreparable. Because the way it worked was that the B-2 bombers launched a number of these massive ordnance penetrators, those 14,000 kilogram bombs, into the main air shafts, into Fordo, and they launched them wave after wave. So the first initial wave of the bombs would create the penetration that the other bombs that were being dropped right after them would then bury down even further. And those massive ordnance penetrators, the fuses, were, each one of them were specifically pre-programmed to explode at a certain distance below ground. So they would essentially compound the damage of the previous bombs that were dropped by this wave of bomber attacks. So on one hand, of course, Iran is claiming that its nuclear program has survived, but we are seeing American intelligence and even European intelligence at the very least suggesting that Iran's nuclear program has been dealt a severe setback. More than likely, it's going to take years for them to reconstitute. And it's, of course, coming at a time when the Israelis have said that they are going to conduct intermittent strikes on Iran's nuclear program.
Yes, so the war between wider conflict between Israel and Iran is not over yet. Maybe direct US involvement is over. Maybe we will not see one-off involvement of that type that we saw on the 22nd of June, but the conflict between Iran and Israel is still kind of underway. We recently interviewed Dr. Eric Goldberg. He's a very famous and also highly regarded expert in Iranian affairs, based in Tel Aviv, by the way. He, in our interview, my colleague Bakhtiar interviewed him, he said that Israel has failed to achieve its fundamental objectives, because that fundamental objective, there have been many objectives, amongst which the central one was decapitation of Iran's nuclear program, and that hasn't happened. What do you make of that claim made by Goldberg?
Well, let's look at the facts. The Israeli Air Force and Mossad have killed perhaps the most senior of Iran's nuclear scientists and physicists, and they're not easy to replace. I mean, these are the most trusted scientists that are working on Iran's underground nuclear program, and their assassinations is going to certainly hurt the knowledge capacity and the capability of Iran to reconstitute its program. And secondly, look, even if some of that nuclear stockpile that's been enriched to 60% survives, it's very difficult to transport it. And there's a certain protocol that takes place in order to transport that enriched uranium. So if, given a scenario where we can imagine the Iranians have dispersed the stockpile, it would be very easily picked up by Israeli and American intelligence if the Iranian military would then start transporting it back into any other sites that could then be targeted by the Israeli Air Force. So the head of the Israeli military, the defense minister Katz, I think from my perspective, said something that was really notable here. What he said was that, hey, October 7th has led to a new paradigm, and the Operation Rising Lion is just the prelude. So what we're seeing here is that Israeli military leadership is essentially suggesting that they will continue intermittent strikes to prevent Iran from attempting to reconstitute its program.
How long those intermittent strikes will sort of take place, continue? Do you expect, so you said that what is described as a Rising Lion operation is just a prelude. If it's not a prelude, then we will have the major part of the process. How long will that take? Well, and what is the ultimate objective of that particular stage aim?
That's a very good question. Now, Katz called Operation Rising Lion the trailer, which means that even essentially we can expect more of these attacks. There is a military doctrine in Israel called the wars between the war. So what that essentially would mean that the Israeli Air Force would launch intermittent strikes that would be one-offs here and there on whether, for example, if they detect the movement of extremely advanced and sensitive equipment or enriched uranium, or, for example, Iran trying to rebuild Fordo. So in that sense, it would be much easier to prevent the Iranian nuclear program from advancing by essentially establishing a new precedent psychologically, and of course both domestically in Israel and from the perspective of deterrence with Iran, that Israel now has essentially said that it is going to maintain its air superiority over Iranian airspace, and that these strikes against what's left of Iran's underground nuclear program will more than likely be in the forms of either special intelligence operations by the Mossad on the ground or airstrikes against efforts or attempts to rebuild or at least salvage what's left of the Iranian underground nuclear program. From what I've seen from the Pentagon's briefing and from the reports that are coming out from the International Energy Atomic Agency, there's no question that this nuclear program has suffered a severe setback. Nuclear scientists assassinated, Bordeaux significantly damaged and buried. Look, this is the result of building a deeply underground fortified structure. It may save you from airstrikes, but if airstrikes like the ones we saw by the American B-2 bombers successfully penetrate, all they need to do is to bury what's left of the equipment underground. So that is essentially the double-edged sword of building your nuclear program deep underground. The Americans only have to be able to both destroy the equipment, but also prevent the entry points and collapse the shafts of Bordeaux. And that seems to what have happened here. Those main shafts that the Israelis detected.
I want to clarify one point. So to understand Iran's nuclear program better, how central and how considerable is Bordeaux within that larger scope, which is referred to as Iran's nuclear program?
It is the central nervous system of Iran's nuclear program, where most of the enrichment of the uranium took place and where most of those advanced centrifuges are placed. But also Isfahan. The difference is that on Isfahan, the Americans only launched Tomahawk cruise missiles.
They didn't use bunker busters in relation to Isfahan.
Correct, exactly. And those Tomahawk cruise missiles cause significant structural damage on the surface, but they cannot penetrate the ground as deep as those 14,000 kilogram massive ordnance penetrators that the B-2 bombers are able to carry. But without Bordeaux, you do not have a nuclear program. So if that equipment, if the centrifuges and the stockpiles are buried hundreds of meters underground and you can't get to them, then essentially that program is going to be significantly set back. And it'll be relatively easy for the Israeli Air Force to strike reconstruction equipment that are above ground or engineers that are trying to salvage what they can out of Bordeaux. And that is the point of where the Israeli Air Force, by maintaining consistent air superiority over Iranian airspace, that is the major advantage that the Israeli Defense Forces have over the Iranian military.
So, of course, obliteration and a considerable setback or severe damage are not the self-same, of course. That's the reason why people are questioning the factual veracity of what President Trump said on the 22nd of June. But what do you make of that argument that Iran is a very resilient entity, and because for them victory did not mean to defeat Israel, actually, in a real sense of the word, but not to be defeated to that extent, which would have led to the ultimate collapse. On that basis, do you think that Iran could actually consider itself victorious for the time being? Because the very objectives, the very fundamental objectives that was, I don't want to refer to that in a crystal clear way, but I think that Benjamin Netanyahu made it very clear. He needed quick and also fundamental solution, but that hasn't happened. On that basis, Iranians believe that on the basis of what we are observing today, the victory is on the side of Iran.
Well, I think we have a new precedent being set, new rules to the conflict between Israel and Iran that have been established. For one, air superiority being established by both the Americans and the Israelis, and the fact that the Israelis demonstrated that their Mossad operatives have been able to penetrate deep behind enemy lines and being able to use them to both assassinate Iranian scientists and senior military officials, as well as locating some of the key launchers of Iran's ballistic missile program. I think that's very significant, and that intelligence penetration by Israel will likely continue into Iranian territory, and that's proved to be extremely embarrassing. And two, Iranian leadership is still highly concerned that Israeli military operatives, as well intelligence operatives, are able to assassinate and locate senior political figures. And the assassination of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has not been taken off the table by the Israelis. So I think we're seeing a significant amount of chaos and confusion internally amongst Iran's top political and military leadership, because they are still, when you are concerned about being assassinated, you stay underground, and your communication with your subordinates and the command and control is cut off and severely curtailed. And that still seems to be the situation in Iran. So that fear of Israeli assassinations, given that we've seen over 20 senior Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard commanders being killed, assassinated, or killed by airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force, that signifies that Israel has very detailed, high fidelity on intelligence or on where Iran's top military and political leadership are located, and that has really struck a nerve in Tehran.
If Iran is allowed to revive what has been lost, how long do you think will it take for them to revive their capability? Assuming that we are living in a world which is very rosy and no one will actually interfere with Iran's affairs, nuclear aspirations, how long will it take for them to revive what they have lost? And plus, how long will it take for them to build what Israel believes should not be there?
Look, we also have to remember President Trump himself has also very much strongly indicated that the US could also launch intermittent airstrikes on Iran if American intelligence and the military believes that Iran is attempting to take action on a large scale to reconstitute its nuclear program. So it's not just the Israelis. So look, remember, it took decades for Iran to build Fordow, Isfahan, and Natanz without airstrikes. But now the signals coming from Washington, coming from
it took actually decades for US to be involved directly.
Exactly. I mean, look, at that Pentagon briefing by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he told the press that 2 specialists in the Pentagon had been their entire job is to focus on Fordow and to figure out a way to penetrate Fordow. For 15 years, Pentagon intelligence specialists have been working with the military on how to attack this problem set, and to use the words of the Pentagon. Okay. And so you have this obsession from the US, from Israel, to prevent the Iranians from reconstituting Fordow. So it is going to be extremely difficult. It's much more difficult to try to reconstitute a nuclear program now that it's buried hundreds of meters underground than to build it in the first place.
Under the circumstances, it's very difficult to say what victory means, because we were discussing the self-same subject, or similar subject, not the self-same of course, in relation to Russia's actions in Ukraine. And there was a question, if there is a deal in the context of which Russia will be allowed to assume control but not sovereignty over the 20% of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine will be allowed to flourish and prosper, in the long run Ukraine will be victorious. So victory there does not necessarily mean the physical control now, but long-term victory. And just sort of translating that logic to what's happening in connection between Iran and Israel, those analysts are saying that Iran has not been decisively defeated. They say that the bar set by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu was so high that the reality on the ground seems to be tilting towards Iranian victory scenario. I think that logic emanates from that understanding of the situation on the ground. Let's move to our region, South Caucasus. It is very clear that it would be fair to say, whatever we may think about the outcome of this particular conflict, to which President Trump referred to as 12-day war, Iran is now a considerably weakened entity.
Oh, no doubt.
I mean, economically, it's not going to benefit them economically. Maybe it will lead to some kind of consolidation at a later stage, but economically and also perhaps militarily, it's not a nice thing to be attacked in this fashion by Israel and the United States. How do you think this outcome will affect Iran's interaction with South Caucasus, and particularly with Azerbaijan? And then we'll come to a telephone conversation between President Aliyev and President Pezeshkian.
Yeah, look, we're right here in the Caspian. Yeah. We are on the border with Iran. And look at what's left of the Iranian military. Its entire air defense network has been essentially turned into Swiss cheese. The Israelis were flying drones and aircraft both during the day and at night, and sweeping any air defense and radars ahead of their bombers. The fact that you also have intelligence penetration. I go back to the fact that Mossad has been able to successfully establish a network of operatives that were able to launch drone strikes on high-value targets, extremely advanced air defense systems, and ballistic missile launchers from within Iranian territory. And the fact that the U.S. President Trump, he set a completely different bar than the Israelis. What President Trump has said is that, hey, we are going to take out Fordow and Natanz and Isfahan, no nuclear bomb, and we want Iran to prosper economically. That was, of course, the president, because he wanted to establish a very limited definition of what victory entails. But look at what's the balance of power in the Caspian. For years, for decades, Iran had projected power into the South Caucasus, into the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Arabian Gulf through its proxies. It had dependent on groups like Hezbollah and Iraqi militant groups and those based in Syria during the time of the former regime of Bashar al-Assad to advance Iran's interests in the region. Most of those militia networks have been either defeated or significantly weakened by the Israelis and by the Americans since the October 7th attack and the subsequent war, in Gaza. So from a military standpoint, from a military balance of power, this is a defanged and declawed Iran. And I think that significantly impacts the balance of power from the entire Caspian all the way down to the Arabian Gulf region.
It's very telling and also informative answer. Thank you for that. Azerbaijan's foreign policy, as I understand it, as many analysts seem to understand it, is based on the idea that, well, of course, strategic partnership with Israel is absolutely a vital component of Azerbaijan's foreign policy. That goes without saying. With Iran, Azerbaijan has been trying to normalize relations over the past few months. President Pezeshkian was here just months ago, I believe, or maybe 2 months ago, and that was sort of a culmination of these efforts aimed at normalization. Azerbaijan and Iran has got some, they've got some common projects: North-South corridor, also Aras corridor, which effectively connecting mainland Azerbaijan via Iran with Nakhchivan exclave. Do you think it is a practicable end to maintain good, mutually beneficial, absolutely legitimate strategic partnership with Israel, and also try to be very constructive vis-à-vis Iran? Bearing in mind Iran's nature as an entity, do you think it is something that will yield positive results in the long run? Because Azerbaijan has maintained neutrality, absolute neutrality, regarding this particular conflict.
Well, look at the contrast. You have one capital, Tehran, where explosions are happening on a regular basis. Its military, its infrastructure is being destroyed and attacked by the Israelis and by the Americans. And look at the prosperity in Baku. You have almost what I call the Abu Dhabi United Arab Emirates model of trade and prosperity and balance of power and access to both the West and to the trading networks of the Far East. So you don't have war here. You don't have missiles exploding everywhere. You've got the investment that was made years ago of the strategic partnership between Azerbaijan and Israel that has really paid off on tenfolds when you look at Israeli military support that it helped in large part Azerbaijan achieve.
For which Azerbaijan paid, of course.
Of course, and achieve the strategic objectives in Karabakh. And of course, from the trade and energy perspective. So when you look at what's happening in Iran, the explosions, the chaos, the weakening of its military infrastructure, nuclear program that cost them so much, both in human capital and billions of dollars that they do not have to spend. On the other hand, a country like Azerbaijan investing in trade relations with Western partners and establishing itself as a model as a trading hub between the West and the Far East. Very similar model that's been established in the Arabian Gulf by the United Arab Emirates and by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
I had many questions to ask, but sadly I will be able to ask only the very last one. It's about the possible triangle involving Azerbaijan, United States and Israel. Recently, Richard Hoagland, former US co-chair of the OEC Minsk Group, wrote for Caspian Policy Center saying that one of the sort of problems, sort of challenges in Azerbaijani and Azerbaijani-US relations has been that Azerbaijani perception of diplomacy is more about top-down engagement. So you actually top-level people engage first, and then that engagement, the results go down.
That's right.
And then for US understanding of diplomacy, he says, is bottom-up. Do you concur with this assessment?
President Trump has his Trump way of doing policy, and that is leadership to leadership. He loves talking on the phone with his foreign counterparts. That is why we've seen President Trump establish such a strong bond with President Erdogan, with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, and of course of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this is a model, a Trump model that will likely help build a bridge from a leadership to leadership perspective with Azerbaijan. The Israelis are saying they want to expand the Abraham Accords. This is President Trump's marquee diplomatic achievement. Azerbaijan will play an important role, I predict, in expanding the Abraham Accords, and that will likely lead to a strong partnership between Baku and Washington.
Thank you very much for your analysis, and thank you, and to you very soon indeed. Probably next time also in the studio, because you're still here as far as I understand. Well, I just conversed with NU's Washington correspondent, Ubi Shapander, about a wide range of issues, including largely, of course, centered around Iran, about Iran's nuclear capabilities, to what extent actually those capabilities have been devastated, and whether we can talk about complete obliteration or not, and also, of course, the impact of what has happened in relation to Iran in connection with South Caucasus. You've been watching Context